Okay, hey, Nick, let's start here. By the way, some absolute bangers up on New Orleans football right now. The trip sit down with Jameis is rare, right? To get a player that open on how he is currently feeling. And it's a very honest interview. And it's a bit of a it's interesting in that he is clearly saying that, personally he wants to play, but he understands that the team's needs come first. But personally, that he also feels like he is the best option for the team going forward. Do you agree? Should Jameis Winston start next week?
Well, I mean, if the idea was that they were going to run with Andy Dalton until the offense didn't look good or the offense wasn't working, I mean, the offense isn't working and it doesn't look good. And, you really go back through the last several games, there's not a lot to really kind of hang your hat on a little bit. Like, he was doing a good job of getting the ball to Alvin, and when things were perfect, they were good for him. But, the Cincinnati game, they get in the 4-minute situation. He becomes inaccurate and can't connect on passes to open receivers. 2 weeks ago, they're in the red zone, and he's overthrowing Marquez Callaway and Chris Olave. Last week, I didn't think was great. Now, granted, he's playing behind a JV offensive line, but it's just kind of that's the reality of the situation right now. And I don't think he did a great job operating. So, look, I mean, even beyond just this season, I think that there's just kind of a situation where they got to figure out what he can do. And I think the idea of it's going to be something magical or something like that, I think that's probably out the window. I mean, our offseason hype on a lot of stuff with this team is kind of wilted throughout the fall. But I think they do have to look at that and kind of see what they can do there and what the offense can look like. I mean, they are committed to him $14 million per year, and they don't have another quarterback, under contract for next year. So they got to see how desperate they are to move on, or if they can try to piece something together. But I mean, I think it's just kind of time to try to do something different because this isn't working.
Well, and then the other elephant in the room, Nick, has to do with Dennis Allen. And I'll ask you a question because you mentioned a JV offensive line. When you look at this team, it has been beset with an overwhelming amount of injuries. There is no doubt about that. And it's hard to coach a team like that. That said, within that context, is Dennis Allen doing a good job?
So there's a couple things here. Let's just go right at it and not beat around the bush. Everybody on social media, everywhere, any store you go into, any person you talk to, they're talking about firing him.
Yeah.
And I'll say this, and this isn't a defense of Dennis Allen at all. Like, I just think the reality of the situation is if you were to fire him today, you're never hiring anybody good because you're now the team that just fired your head coach 10 games into a season after 11 or 12 major starters were down in a game, and you don't have a first-round pick, and your cap situation isn't great. So if that's your advertising spiel to, like, hey, come work for us, you're not hiring anybody that has a second option. You're hiring somebody that has no options, and they're going to be horrible too. Like, your next coach that you hire, you want him to be coveted by other teams because that means he's actually good and he's known to be good. And, there's usually a couple of those guys every year, and then there's everybody else. And when you look back at it, it's almost always, save for a couple surprises, it's almost always the guys that, look like they're probably going to be pretty good and they're more than deserving for a shot. And they've interviewed more than one place. So if for no other reason, you need to let Dennis Allen finish the season so you aren't that team, so you can go out there and get somebody else. I think there's a lot of things with, how this team is playing that could be a lot better. You can't tackle. It's 10 weeks into the season, and they're still talking about, well, we got to drill the fundamentals. Well, I mean, like, what have you been doing? So, I mean, it's just some of this stuff has to get better at some point, and it isn't. But, I think logically, though, too, like, the injuries are a factor. Like, they have to be. When Idris Pete and James Hurst and Eric McCoy aren't, playing on your offensive line, it's tough to block. Lewis Kidd goes in there, and it's just, it doesn't look great. And, Calvin Throckmorton's in there, and it doesn't look great. And, you got a center in there. He's not doing a great job either, Andrews. I mean, so it's tough to play like that. You take Marshawn Lattimore and Marcus May out of your secondary and Bradley Roby. I mean, it's tough to play like that. So he's definitely been handcuffed to some degree. And I think if they were healthy, some of the stuff that they weren't doing well would be disguised a little bit because they'd probably have another win or two somewhere along the way. But, still some of those issues are glaring, and to still have the false starts and the missed tackles and all the stuff that was showing up truthfully in the preseason, and then week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. I mean, for it still to be here in week 10, I mean, that at some point, that says something about the process isn't working the way it should.
All right, Nick. Let me stick on the DA one then, because well, I guess I hadn't even considered really like firing Allen now. To me, the question was always of like, does fire him at the end of the season change anything about what you just said, though, right? Like, does that make the Saints attractive if they just let him play out the year? I guess my question is more like, do you give him a second year? And are you telling me there's just not enough information right now? We have to let this thing play out.
I mean, I know the people listening to this want everyone to say fire him now, burn it down, tear it down, all that stuff. But I think you let him play out the season, you evaluate it, you see how it goes. Maybe you get some guys back healthy, and you kind of look at it through that prism and see where you're at with it. The right now thing, I mean, like there's petitions and stuff, and I understand why everybody's feeling the way they feel. I mean,
that boy Wolf is popping off.
Underwhelming.
That boy Wolf is popping off right now on Twitter.
No question. It's frustrating to watch, and the same mistakes over and over. But yeah, I think it's going to be decided in how they play out the rest of the season. And if does he lose the locker room? Do they keep playing hard for him? Is there a downturn? I think all that stuff's going to kind of determine it. But yeah, I just don't think you can fire him 10 games into the season. I think that's just I understand like the fan aspect of that, but like from a practical standpoint, I mean, that's just not something you can do. And I mean, Mickey Loomis doesn't operate that way. But yeah, I think end of the year, you sit down, you look at it, and you say, okay, we made this attempt to preserve our culture, Sean Payton's culture. We did everything we could to kind of keep the roster together. We kept the coaching staff in place. Did this work? And if the answer is no, then the next question is, can it work? And is it worth finding a way to make it work? And I think those are the questions they got to figure out at the end of the year. But I mean, if they fire him end of the year and it's, they're a 3, 4, 5 win team, I don't think that necessarily hurts you with anyone else. But, if you wake up on Monday morning and say, well, Marcus May didn't play, Marshawn Lattimore didn't play, Bradley Roby didn't play, Pete, McCoy, Mike Thomas is injured, Mark Ingram's out, and you go down the list, there's 11 guys, and you fire somebody, the next person that you're offering the job to is going to say, whoa, like, you guys are crazy. There's no way I'm going there. So, I mean, from that aspect, I think it would hurt. But, yeah, end of the season, there's going to be a broad enough picture. And I think it's going to be pretty obvious to anyone looking at it, whether it worked or not. And I think whatever direction they take, it'll probably look pretty logical.
When you look at it being that window open for so long, and it looks like it's closing, right? And in the NFL, like it typically is a 3-4 year window. It's been a long time for the Saints. I mean, really since Drew Brees and Sean Payton got to town, Nick, that window was open. And it looks like for the first time that it might be closed. So could you see a scenario where everyone does go, like they completely hit reset? Because it's tough to hit reset when you don't have draft picks, when you don't have valuable pieces really because of contracts and injury history and all that you can trade to get draft picks. So like it feels like that possibly could be a path, but it'd be a difficult path to blow it all up because you don't really have the foundation to build upon.
See, I'm a guy that goes outside and I look up at the sky and I'm like, oh, it's partly sunny, so like it's always tough for me to really see like all that, I look at him, I see a lot of good young players still, and some decent guys that you have that are, middle-aged NFL-wise, like Marshawn, that are worth keeping around. And it doesn't look that far off. Like, you got Pete Werner, McCoy, Olave. I'm going to throw this guy in there now because he looks good. Cesar Ruiz, Lattimore. You got decent young corners. I think Avante Taylor has some seasoning to do that he needs to do to get a little bit better. But there are some solid building blocks still on this team that I think doesn't put you super far off. And look, they're still in a pretty bad division. And I think a year from now, it's still going to be a pretty bad division. And if somehow they could find a way to get a quarterback and just figure out how to get their talent to play the way it should, because look, I still look at this team, and granted, a million injuries, so it isn't the same team, but I still look at this team and I see a decent roster. Like, I don't think it's a Jaguars situation. And, my other thing with tearing it down and rebuilding, I think when you stop trying to compete, you get in this spot where you're never competitive again. And there's so many teams that have just been perpetually rebuilding forever. Houston, the Jaguars, the Jets are finally starting to come out of it. You talk to a Jets fan, they're happy that they're just relevant for the first time in 15 years. Go around the league. I mean, there's just so many of them that are just also Rams that just never figure it out, never get better. And it's because at some point they made the decision to say, we're not going to be competitive and we're going to tear down to try to step back up. And you never step up. Like, you just get stuck in that spot. Let's say you do that and then you get a good draft pick and you select a quarterback and the quarterback isn't good, which happens all the time early in the draft. Like, now you have nothing and you just end up stuck in place. And I think that's a scary place to be. So, I mean, I think there's a little bit of a, peel off a couple boards, and get some guys that maybe aren't part of your plans in 23, 24, and you make those decisions now and get some assets for them. But I don't think it's a tear down to the stud situation. I still think there's some decent, good young players here. Next year, practically speaking, Alvin's probably going to miss some time for the suspension. May's going to miss some time for the suspension. So I think coming right out of the gates, you are losing some games probably, and you might be in a situation. But even with their cap, you start looking at the numbers going down the list. A lot of those guys are kind of locked in for next year, so it kind of feels like more of a hold tight situation, and then you come out the other side of that and kind of see where you're at. But just the complete blow it up, start over thing, I don't see that. But yeah, I mean, I could definitely see a little bit, trying to think more forward thinking than in the present, but I don't think you go all the way into that.
Nick, last one here. I know we're keeping you long like we always do, but we love talking Nick Underhill of New Orleans football, and you can tell from this that he has an excellent grasp of the situation at every single level. And maybe this is a bit of an odd question right after you laid out that, the roster probably isn't as dour as it feels. But in terms of field, continuing to watch CD Deuce perform on primetime, lead the league in picks. He's literally leading the NFL in picks, by the way, Saints fans. If you don't know that, he has 6 picks in the year. Von Bell's 4th in the league. Marcus Williams got 3 of his own. I guess the point of all this is, there's the old saying about reputation, right? It takes a lifetime to build up. It can be torn down so quickly. All of a sudden, what was once viewed as one of their greatest strengths, a lot of people are really questioning the Saints front office right now. And, I mean, I guess I ask you, has this front office ruined their reputation with the moves of this offseason? Are you confident in them going forward if you do have to enter some sort of hybrid rebuild?
I think that has probably been a little bit of a sobering situation for them. I mean, everything they did this offseason, they did with the idea that they were going to be a contender. And, there's a lot of talk about they got to fight to protect that Philadelphia pick, make it as low as possible. And I was kind of thinking that way for a while myself. And now you kind of take a step back from it and it's well, wouldn't it be better if they picked 37th instead of 47th? Because they need pieces.
Yes.
And now that's a better asset.
Yeah.
The only person that pick matters for the optics of it is Mickey Loomis. And, he's the one that ultimately that goes back to as far as, where the blame goes for that trade. So for him, yeah, I think it matters because that's the way people talk. But all that stuff is kind of temporary. They have a good offseason and they become competitive again. That still hurts. I mean, that's still one of the top things on the list of things they did wrong. But I think this whole situation's been a little bit, revealing and sobering for everybody. I mean, the value of Sean Payton, I think, was extremely underestimated by everybody. And yeah. I actually, I'm in there as well. I thought maybe it would be a 2-win variance. It turns out it's a 5-win variance.
Yeah.
It's kind of shocking how much, things have kind of fallen a little bit so quickly. And again, there's circumstances within that, but I mean, I think it's pretty obvious the value that he had to this team. So, I think they've drafted well. I think they've made a lot of good decisions in free agency. I think they just had, some stuff that really went sideways on them this year. But I mean, the jury's out on everybody with Sean out of that building and his voice out of those player acquisition meetings, the value of that might be coming to light too. So it might, it's a lot to prove. It's a lot to figure out. And, I think it's just kind of fair to be in a situation where you're looking at everybody kind of skeptically now, where things used to be a little bit more assumed. So I think what anyone feels about anything right now, I think is extremely fair, because I can't really point at too many things besides Chris Olave that went right this offseason. I mean, their safety strategy, the lead up to this question. I mean, you signed 2 free agents. you just named 3 guys they drafted. So, like, why didn't you draft Brisker or something like that? Like, that's the one thing you probably did better than anybody else in the league is scout, develop, and play safeties. And for some reason, you spend a ton of money on, a guy that's at the end of his career, May, who's, got a, I don't think it's quite done what it was supposed to be in that situation yet either. And meanwhile, your whole crop of guys is just out here killing it, and you have 2 interceptions total. It's a tough look right now. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's very fair to be skeptical about everything that's going to happen. I do still think Mickey Loomis is a good GM. That might blow up in my face down the road for saying it, but I think that he has made a lot of good decisions. And I think they just got to really kind of recalculate where they're at. And, I think they just really, really, overvalued the system they had in place and taking Sean out of it. I think it's been shocking to everybody.
Sheesh. I did not realize the Saints only had 2 picks in the year. So CD Deuce has tripled you up alone.
Tyron has both, and there's only 2.
Yeah. Nick Underhill at New Orleans. Football is a site. Nick_Underhill on Twitter. Nick, you and Tripp and the boys and the whole crew, keep up the excellent work, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And yeah, look, I know LSU Sports Connect says we got multiple injuries in every position group for real. I mean, the injuries are absurd, which is what makes us all a little hard to judge. But I guess you just got to answer whether or not you think that you're performing well within that context.
I mean, that's the NFL.
That's the NFL. The Chargers have had absurd injuries.
It just is. It's just, unfortunately, it's part of the NFL. And that's why you always hear, like, the old savvy vets, like, the team that stays healthy, it's got the best chance of winning it all.
Yeah, straight up.
I mean, it sounds so cliche because it is, but it's true.